I stared at the padlock hanging from the barn doors, my inheritance key trembling in my palm. Because what Grandpa hid inside didn't just ruin him, it destroyed 3 generations of our family. Before we dive in, let me tell you, hit subscribe while you're here. Tomorrow I'm dropping a story that'll make this one look tame. I was 22 years old when the lawyer called about Grandpa Joseph's farm. I'd been working double shifts at a diner in Columbus, barely scraping by in a studio apartment that smelled like mold and broken dreams. The call came on a Tuesday, right in the middle of the lunch rush. "Miss Richardson, this is Thomas Kepler from Kepler and Associates. I'm handling your grandfather's estate. We need to discuss your inheritance." I almost dropped the coffee pot I was holding. Grandpa Joseph had died 6 months earlier, and I hadn't even known about it until 3 weeks after the funeral. Nobody thought to tell me. Then again, nobody in the family had spoken to me since I was 17, when I'd chosen college over staying on the farm like a proper Richardson woman was supposed to. The lawyer's office was in a town called Millbrook, population 3,000 and shrinking. I'd never been there, never even heard Grandpa mention it. According to Mr. Kepler, Grandpa had owned 147 acres there, plus a farmhouse and barn that had been sitting empty since his death. "Your grandfather was very specific in his will," Mr. Kepler said, sliding papers across his desk. "Everything goes to you, Natalie. The land, the buildings, and a savings account with approximately $9,000. I stared at the documents, trying to process what this meant. Why me? What about my mom? My aunts? Mr. Kepler's expression shifted, something careful and legal crossing his face. "Your grandfather's relationship with his daughters was complicated. The will specifically excludes them. You're listed as sole beneficiary." That night, I drove out to see the property. The farmhouse was a 2-story disaster, with peeling paint and a porch that sagged like a broken promise. But it was the barn that caught my attention, massive and red, with a newer padlock on the doors that looked completely out of place among all the decay. I tried my keys. None of them fit. Over the next week, I started cleaning out the farmhouse. It was full of Grandpa's things, furniture from the 1960s, photographs of people I didn't recognize, and boxes of financial records that painted a confusing picture. He'd bought this property in 2003, paying cash. Before that, according to the documents, he'd owned a much larger farm about 60 miles south that he'd sold for nearly $500,000. But the barn stayed locked. I asked Mr. Kepler about it during our second meeting. "Did Grandpa leave a key for the barn?" He frowned, checking his files. "There's no mention of it. Have you tried bolt cutters?" I had, actually. The lock was commercial grade, the kind you'd use for a storage unit or a safe. It would take serious equipment to break it, and something about that felt wrong. Grandpa had left me everything else with clear instructions. Why would he lock the barn and not leave me a way in? The answer came from an unexpected source. I was sorting through a box of old photographs when I found a letter addressed to me, dated just 2 weeks before Grandpa died. My hand shook as I opened it. "Natalie, if you're reading this, then you know about the farm. I'm sorry for leaving you with this burden, but you're the only one I trust. Your mother and her sisters, they have their father's weakness. They'd sell everything and never look back. But you always ask the hard questions. The key to the barn is where we kept our secrets, in the place only you would remember. What's inside will explain everything. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I'm sorry I couldn't fix what I broke. But maybe you can. The combination is your birthday, the year I should have told the truth. Grandpa Joseph. I read it 5 times, trying to understand. Where we kept our secrets? I'd only met Grandpa Joseph a handful of times as a kid before the family split. I had vague memories of visiting a different farm when I was maybe 7 or 8, before everything fell apart. Then it hit me. The old farm, the one he'd sold, there'd been a place there, a little stone spring house where Grandpa had kept milk and butter cold before he got a proper refrigerator. He'd shown it to me once, made it seem like our special discovery. We'd hidden a coffee can there with treasures inside, rocks and coins, and a plastic ring from a gumball machine. I drove to the old property that afternoon. It had been sold years ago, and the new owners had built a modern house where Grandpa's farmhouse used to stand. But the spring house was still there, overgrown and forgotten at the edge of their property line. My heart pounded as I pushed through the weeds. Inside, the spring house was dark and damp, but I found what I was looking for. The coffee can was still wedged in a gap between stones, rusty and ancient. Inside was a small brass key and a folded piece of paper that had somehow stayed dry. The paper had 4 numbers written in Grandpa's handwriting: 7/18/1997, July 18th, 1997, my birthday, and a year that meant nothing to me yet. Back at the barn, I tried the key. It slid into the padlock perfectly. The mechanism clicked open, and I pulled the heavy doors wide, afternoon light spilling into the darkness inside. What I saw made my breath catch. The barn wasn't full of old equipment or hay bales. It was full of filing cabinets, dozens of them organized in neat rows. And on the far wall, someone had created a massive timeline using newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by red string like something from a detective movie. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The timeline started in 1982 and ended in 2003. Every article, every photograph, every note was about the same thing: the Henderson chemical fire. My stomach turned cold. I knew about Henderson Chemical. Everyone in Ohio did. In July 1997, their facility had exploded, killing 43 workers and poisoning the groundwater for miles around. It had been one of the worst industrial disasters in state history. The company had gone bankrupt from lawsuits, and the CEO had died by suicide before the criminal trial. But what did this have to do with Grandpa? I started reading the notes pinned to the timeline. They were written in Grandpa's precise handwriting, documenting meetings, decisions, and cover-ups. And then I found it, a photograph of Grandpa shaking hands with Roger Henderson, the CEO, dated March 1996. Beneath it, Grandpa had written, "The day I sold my soul." What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I spent the next 3 hours reading through documents that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. Grandpa Joseph hadn't just known about Henderson Chemical. He'd been their environmental consultant, hired to conduct soil and water testing around their facility. And he'd lied. He'd falsified reports, hidden evidence of contamination, and helped Roger Henderson cut corners that made the facility a ticking time bomb. The filing cabinets were full of the real test results. the actual data that showed dangerous chemical levels months before the explosion. Data that Grandpa had buried in exchange for quarterly payments of $15,000. I found the deposit records, all of it. From March 1996 to July 1997, Grandpa had taken nearly $250,000 to lie. And then 43 people died. There were photographs of the victims on the timeline. Working people with families, people who'd trusted that their workplace was safe. I recognized some of the names from news coverage over the years. They'd become symbols of corporate greed and regulatory failure. But the real failure had started with my grandfather's signatures on falsified reports. The worst part was the letter I found in the bottom drawer of the last filing cabinet. It was addressed to the State Environmental Agency, dated July 10, 1997, 8 days before the explosion. In it, Grandpa confessed everything. He detailed the falsified reports, the payments from Henderson, the contamination levels that had been hidden. He urged immediate inspection and shutdown of the facility. The letter was signed, sealed in an envelope with proper postage, ready to send, but he'd never mailed it. Instead, he'd locked it in this barn with all the other evidence of his guilt. I sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the paper trail of my grandfather's cowardice, and finally understood why my family had fallen apart. Mom had been 26 when the explosion happened. She'd been living with Grandpa on the old farm, helping him run the place. She must have known something was wrong. Maybe she'd even known what he'd done. The family split made sense now. Not some petty argument about money or inheritance, but the toxic fallout of discovering that your father had blood on his hands. Mom and her sisters had probably told Grandpa to turn himself in, to make it right. And he'd refused, so they'd cut him off completely, moved away, and tried to forget they were Richardsons. But they'd never told me the truth. They'd just let me grow up thinking Grandpa was a difficult man who'd had some vague falling out with his daughters. They'd kept his secret even while hating him for it. I found my phone and called Mom for the first time in 3 years. "Natalie?" Her voice was shocked, wary. "I'm at Grandpa's farm, the one in Millbrook. I found the barn." The silence on the other end was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You need to burn it. All of it. Don't tell anyone what he did. Mom, there are 43 families who never got justice. 43 people who died because Roger Henderson was greedy and negligent." She cut me off. "Your grandfather made terrible choices, but he didn't set that fire. Exposing him now won't bring those people back. It'll just destroy what's left of our family name and make their deaths meaningless all over again. How is hiding the truth honoring their memory?" "You don't understand," Mom said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "After it happened, your grandfather wanted to confess. He was going to go to the police with everything, but the lawyers got to him first. Henderson Chemicals lawyers. They told him that if he talked, they'd make sure he went to prison for criminal negligence, that they'd tie him to the explosion as a co-conspirator. They said they'd go after his assets, his farm, everything. They'd leave his family with nothing. So he stayed quiet to protect himself. To protect us, Mom insisted. I was pregnant with you. Your Aunt Linda had 3 kids under 5. Aunt Carol was in nursing school. He thought he was making the right choice, keeping us safe. It destroyed him. He sold the old farm because he couldn't stand living where he'd made those decisions. He bought that place in Millbrook and spent 20 years documenting everything, building that timeline like he could change the past if he arranged the evidence just right. I looked around the barn at Grandpa's obsessive work. This wasn't just guilt. This was a man trying to absolve himself through documentation, creating a confession he'd never have the courage to voice. "What do you want me to do, Mom?" "Burn it," she repeated. "Sell the land, take the money, and move on with your life. Don't let his mistakes define you." But I couldn't do that. Not after reading the names of the victims, not after seeing the evidence that might still matter to their families. I told Mom I needed time to think and ended the call. Over the next week, I consulted with 3 different lawyers, trying to understand what would happen if I turned over Grandpa's evidence. The statute of limitations for his fraud had expired. He couldn't be prosecuted posthumously, but the evidence could reopen civil cases against Henderson Chemical's successor companies and might help families who'd received inadequate settlements. It would also destroy my family's reputation completely. The Richardson name would be forever linked to one of Ohio's worst industrial disasters. Mom, my aunts, maybe even me would face public judgment and private consequences. I spent hours sitting in that barn, looking at the timeline, trying to decide who I wanted to be. The granddaughter who protected her family's secrets, or the person who believed 43 dead workers deserved the full truth, no matter the cost. The answer came from an unexpected conversation. I'd hired a local handyman named Marcus to help with repairs on the farmhouse, and one afternoon he mentioned his dad had worked at Henderson Chemical, had been one of the 43. "Mom never got over it," Marcus said, as we replaced a broken window. "The settlement barely covered his funeral. The company declared bankruptcy so fast that most families got nothing. Mom worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. She died 5 years ago, still angry, still wondering why nobody saw the problems before that plant exploded." I made my decision that night. I contacted an investigative journalist named Sarah Chen, who'd written extensively about corporate accountability and industrial disasters. I told her about the barn and what it contained. "I need you to understand something," I said when we met. "Publishing this will hurt my family, my mom, my aunts. They'll never forgive me. But those 43 people and their families deserve the truth." Sarah spent 2 days going through the documents, photographing everything, verifying details. When she left, she promised to handle the story carefully, to focus on the institutional failures rather than personal condemnation. "Your grandfather made terrible choices," she said, "but he also preserved evidence that powerful people wanted destroyed. That matters." The article published 6 weeks later in a major Ohio newspaper. "The Henderson Chemical Cover-Up: How One Man's Silence Helped Bury the Truth." Detailed everything Grandpa had documented. It named him, explained his role, and showed how his falsified reports had been used to avoid regulatory scrutiny in the months before the explosion. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Some people praised my decision to come forward. Families of victims contacted me to say thank you, that finally having the complete truth brought them a measure of peace. Several lawyers filed new civil suits using Grandpa's evidence, going after companies that had acquired Henderson Chemical's assets. But the backlash was brutal. Mom stopped speaking to me completely. My aunt sent angry emails calling me selfish and cruel. People in Grandpa's old town recognized the Richardson name and made sure I knew what they thought of my family. Someone spray painted Killer's granddaughter on the farmhouse siding. The hate mail started arriving within days of the article's publication. Envelopes with no return address, filled with letters that called me a traitor, accused me of profiting from tragedy, demanded I leave Ohio entirely. One person sent me copies of the victim obituaries with my family name scrawled across each one in red marker. Another mailed photos of the explosion aftermath, charred debris and body bags, with a note that said, "Your grandfather's legacy." I stopped sleeping well. Every car that drove past the farm made me jump. Every unexpected sound had me looking over my shoulder. The isolation that had felt peaceful when I first inherited the property now felt dangerous, like I was exposed and vulnerable out here alone. Marcus noticed during one of his visits, he found me standing by the kitchen window at 2 in the afternoon, watching the road like I expected someone to come for me. "You doing okay?" he asked gently. I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, but something about his steady presence made me honest. "I'm scared. People are so angry. What if someone decides hate mail isn't enough?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mom used to have nightmares about the explosion. She'd wake up screaming, convinced she smelled chemicals burning. It went on for years. The not knowing why it happened, why nobody stopped it. That ate at her almost as much as losing Dad. What you did, giving her those answers before she died, that would have meant everything." His words helped, but they didn't erase the fear. I installed security cameras around the property and started keeping the doors locked, even during the day. The farm that was supposed to be my fresh start had become a fortress against the consequences of my choice. Then something unexpected happened. A woman named Jennifer Martinez showed up at my door on a cold morning in October. She was in her 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much grief. "I'm sorry to just appear like this," she said. "I'm Jennifer Martinez. My brother Carlos died in the Henderson explosion. He was 28 years old, engaged to be married. I read the article about your grandfather's evidence." My stomach clenched, preparing for anger or accusations. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "I didn't come here to blame you," she said quickly. "I came to say thank you. The lawyers contacted me last week. Because of your grandfather's documents, they found proof that the company knew about the contamination levels and chose to hide them. We're part of a new class action lawsuit. After 27 years of being told there wasn't enough evidence, we finally have a real chance at justice." She started crying, and I found myself crying too. Two strangers connected by tragedy and truth standing on my grandfather's porch. "My mother died thinking Carlos's death was just bad luck," Jennifer continued. "Just a terrible accident that nobody could have prevented. But it wasn't. People made choices that killed him, and now, finally, we can hold them accountable. Your grandfather was one of those people who made wrong choices, but you made a different choice. That matters." After she left, I went back into the barn and looked at the timeline with different eyes. Grandpa had spent 2 decades arranging and rearranging this evidence, adding notes and connections, obsessively documenting his guilt. I'd thought it was about seeking forgiveness or trying to rewrite history, but maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he'd been building a confession, creating a record that would outlast his cowardice. He hadn't been brave enough to mail that letter or turn himself in while he was alive. But he'd made sure the evidence survived. He'd made sure it would eventually reach someone who might be braver than him. He'd left it to me. Over the following months, more victims' families reached out. Some were angry at first, needing someone to direct their rage toward. I let them yell, let them tell me exactly what my grandfather had helped destroy. I owed them that much. But others were like Jennifer, grateful to finally have answers, to finally have evidence that might lead to accountability. The lawsuits progressed slowly through the courts. Sarah Chen wrote follow-up articles tracking the legal battles. The story gained national attention, becoming a case study in corporate malfeasance and the long shadow of industrial disasters. Documentary filmmakers contacted me about doing a project. Universities invited me to speak about ethics and whistleblowing. I turned most of it down. This wasn't about building a platform or becoming some kind of activist celebrity. This was about 43 people who'd gone to work one day and never came home, and the families who'd spent nearly 3 decades without complete answers. But I did start giving occasional talks at colleges, using Grandpa's timeline as a teaching tool. I'd show students the progression of his choices, how small compromises had accumulated into catastrophic consequences, how fear and greed could make good people do terrible things, and how silence, even silence that felt protective, could be its own form of violence. Mom never did forgive me. We exchanged emails occasionally, stilted and formal, about practical matters like tax documents and family medical history. She remarried and didn't invite me to the wedding. When I sent a gift anyway, she wrote a brief thank you note that could have been written to a stranger. Aunt Linda was slightly better. She sent me a card on my birthday with a short message. I understand why you did it. I wish you hadn't, but I understand. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, and that felt like progress. The farm became my permanent home. I fixed up the house slowly, room by room, making it mine rather than Grandpa's. I painted over the graffiti and eventually stopped checking the security cameras obsessively. The threatening letters tapered off as the news cycle moved on to other scandals and tragedies. Marcus became a real friend, one of the few people in Millbrook who didn't treat me like either a hero or a villain. Just someone who'd made a hard choice and was living with the consequences. We'd have coffee on the porch sometimes, talking about nothing important, and that normalcy felt precious. I kept living on the property anyway, fixing it up slowly with the money from Grandpa's savings. The barn became something different in my mind. Not a shrine to guilt, but a testament to the cost of silence. I started giving tours to journalism students and ethics classes, using Grandpa's timeline to teach about moral courage and the consequences of choosing comfort over truth. Marcus helped me create a memorial on the property, 43 trees planted in a grove behind the barn, each one with a small plaque bearing a victim's name. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start toward honoring the people whose deaths Grandpa's silence had helped obscure. 2 years after I inherited the farm, I received a letter from a woman named Patricia Flores. Her husband had died in the Henderson explosion, leaving her with 2 young sons. Using evidence from Grandpa's files, her lawyer had successfully sued one of the successor companies for undisclosed assets. The settlement had paid off her house and funded her son's college education. "I'm not writing to absolve your grandfather," the letter said. "What he did was unforgivable. But what you did, coming forward when it cost you everything, that took real courage. My boys will have opportunities their father never got to see them enjoy. Thank you for choosing the hard right over the easy wrong." I framed that letter and hung it in the barn, right next to Grandpa's timeline. Because the truth is complicated. Grandpa Joseph was a coward who let greed and fear make him complicit in tragedy. But he also spent 20 years documenting his guilt, creating the evidence that eventually brought some measure of justice. And me? I'm the granddaughter who inherited his farm and his secrets, who chose to expose the truth even though it cost me my family's love and any chance at a quiet life. Some days I wonder if I made the right choice, if protecting Mom and my aunts from public shame should have mattered more than abstract principles about truth and justice. But then I walk through that grove of 43 trees, and I remember that these weren't abstract principles. They were people, workers who deserved a safe workplace, families who deserved the truth about why their loved ones died. The farm is mine now, fully and completely. I've started leasing some of the land to a young organic farmer, and I'm converting part of the barn into a community space for environmental education. It feels right somehow, using this place that represented Grandpa's worst choices to teach about accountability and the importance of speaking up when something's wrong. Mom still won't talk to me. Maybe she never will. I've made peace with that, or at least I'm learning to. Sometimes doing the right thing means losing people you love. Sometimes inheritance isn't just property and money. Sometimes it's the burden of deciding what to do with secrets that aren't yours, but become your responsibility anyway. I inherited a bankrupt farm and discovered that what ruined my family wasn't poverty or bad luck. It was a grandfather who chose money over morals, silence over accountability, and the comfort of his family over the lives of 43 strangers. And I'm the one who decided those strangers mattered more than protecting his memory. Every morning, I wake up in Grandpa Joseph's farmhouse and make that choice again. To live with the consequences of truth-telling, to honor the victims over the family name, to believe that some secrets are too important to keep buried, no matter what they cost. The barn doesn't scare me anymore. It's just a building full of filing cabinets and fading newspaper clippings, evidence of one man's guilt and another person's choice to bring it to light. And somewhere in those documents and timelines and painful truths, I found out who I am. Not just Joseph Richardson's granddaughter, but someone who believes that the dead deserve justice more than the living deserve comfortable lies. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear about the cost of truth and the courage it takes to do what's right, even when it destroys everything you have. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Would you have protected your family's secret or exposed the truth? Your perspective matters, and I read every comment. And if you want more stories about impossible choices and unexpected inheritance, click on one of the videos on your screen right now.